Art is good. It's good to engage in, it's good to make, and it benefits our souls. So why do people feel the need to ask so many questions when we talk to them about our art? If you tell someone that you're going to school for business or for law, the questions don't flood out in the same capacity, which is ironic considering if you said, I'm going to school for business, it might be a reasonable question to ask, well, what manner of business are you going into? But when you tell someone that you're interested in art, that you like making art, that you might want to do something with it for your livelihood, and, oh goodness, if you were to admit that you were thinking about going to art school, well, the questions just flood in. How are you going to make money doing this? Do you think that it's actually reasonable? Maybe you should pursue education or graphic design because those are rational art careers, places where people actually can sink their teeth in and make some money. But this is a funny thing, is it not? When someone tells you they're getting into volleyball, you don't sit there and cross your arms and ask them, well, when are you going to try out for the professionals? Are you going to try to do something with this? I see that you've been spending a lot of time at the gym lately rock climbing. Well, are you going to seek sponsorship? Are you going to try to put your time invested into basketball into attempting to get into the NBA, you 37-year-old 5'6" man? No, we don't do the same things, but for some reason with creative endeavors, this is just how we move forward. Brandon Sanderson, a well-known fantasy author, has talked about how awkward this is for people in his world, writers. When you tell someone that you're working on a novel, working on a book, one of the first questions that seems to pop up is, well, how much is done? When are you going to finish? Are you going to seek publication? And if you're not going to seek publication, then why have you bothered wasting all your time? He is actually the one that I first heard mention this, that he has friends who go and play sports, but no one seems to question whether there's purpose and goodness to be attained in their time invested in that avenue of life. And yet, the finishing of a piece of art, whether it be a book, a painting, or a drawing, is good for the human soul, in the same way that playing basketball with your friends is, or rock climbing, or just continuing to make sure that your body stays in better shape. Perhaps art and music and crafts like these are good for the development of the brain. They keep your brain working out in the same capacity that the rock climbing helps out your body. Perhaps these help us fight aging or relive glory days in certain unanticipated ways. Suffice it to say, one way or the other, though, art is important. And we needn't qualify it with all of these awkward things that our society and our culture sometimes throws our way. Welcome to the session. My name is Zach. I'm sorry for the long ramble at the beginning of this one, but sometimes I just get going and it's hard to stop. What I'm working on in the background is another Inktober prompt. This one was map. I debated for a while whether I should do something that was linked to my stories, and I decided to go that route. So the map that is being depicted here is from the book that I'm working on, this gargantuan project that has been eating away at the back of my mind for the last 21 or 22 years. It becomes difficult to ascertain when I actually started it because, well, that was a long time ago. We didn't have all of the digital record keeping that we do now. This has been one of the beautiful parts about my sketching, the sketchbook sessions, and the Inktober work recently, is it's given me an excuse to dive into things that I might not have otherwise. Obviously the prompt is map, so I could have done any map. In fact, some of my first sketches were of a pirate type of man stabbing a map on the table or slapping the map on the wall behind him. These ideas were fine. In fact, the sketches were rather interesting with the perspective of the knife coming into the map as it approaches the viewer. But it was the evasion of something that could have purpose. All of the things linked to my stories are more interesting to me. They're more valuable. And there's a worry anytime I work on them that sometimes keeps me from touching them because they exist in my brain as these ethereal, beautiful things because they have no form. This happens to us as artists often. We have these ideas that float around in our brain that we think are very developed and wonderful. And generally, they're just emotion. They are not solid. They are not corporeal. They are, by definition, ethereal. They just exist as like wisps floating in the air. So I chose to actually invest my time into something that is valuable to me, something that is important. And that, of course, carries with it the weight of risk. There is some risk now that I could screw up the thing that I value so much. And the biggest danger here is the possibility of realizing that your ideas don't hold water, that they aren't all that magnificent, that they aren't all that interesting. I think we often fear this. We fear the possibility that our artworks, that our creations, that our ideas are derivative, unimportant, uninteresting. I mean, what worse condemnation is there for an artist, for a creative individual, than for their work to be uninteresting? I can't think of anything really that would be more insulting. If I were to bring my ideas to a person and say, these are all the things that I have, these are my deepest, darkest secrets of creative ingenuity, and someone just says, that would be so much worse than someone just outright condemning it, wouldn't it? Think about your beautiful creations, your ideas, the things that you really yearn to bring to life. And really, at the end of the day, the deepest fear is that they're bad, that they're not interesting, that they're not going to be well received by the populace or by yourself. And I think for me, that's the biggest fear with all these things. And that fear comes from a youthful part of me, partially because I started working on these stories either at the tail end of middle school or the beginning of high school. It's hard for me to track, and it has actually been quite a long time. I've started going back through some old sketchbooks, and there are pages missing from the 2001 to 2003 time period. And I would assume that that's where things are, that the things that I'm missing are somewhere in that, and I just don't know where I would have stored those pieces of work. At some point, I will tear things apart and try to find them, but the reality is that that is a long time ago. I've moved many times since then, and there's an overwhelming likelihood that those pieces are simply gone forever. But it doesn't really matter. It's the part of myself that is still a child that is worried that the ideas are uninteresting or unimportant. As I start to write things now, as I start to work through my stories, I have come to the conclusion that I have to be willing to change things. And this has come at a very fundamental level, which I was surprised. I tend to be quite stubborn, but as I've started to work through things and I write out a character's name 700 times as I work through the pages, I've come to the conclusion that some of these names might need to be changed. Some of them look fine on the page, but they might actually not be particularly pronounceable. Kind of a funny issue, isn't it? I've come to the conclusion personally that for me, the stories and the world are more important. I am more obsessed with getting those things out there so I can see them and so other people can see them. And if that means that I have to change something as fundamental as a character's name or a portion of the plot, that's fine. I'm not married to those things. The story and the world are more important. And I think for all of us as artists, as creatives, as writers, whatever it might be, those things are going to be different. I'm not saying that you should feel the same way that I feel. Not at all. Not in any capacity. There are going to be different things for each creative project that are undebatable, unchangeable, immalleable, things that you have to hold on to, the crux of what you're doing. For me, though it's probably not the wisest way to have pursued it, it's the world, and then, secondarily, the story, and thirdly, the interesting pieces of the characters. I know this isn't the greatest way to do this. I know that Tolkien started by working on the languages and the world and story and then characters kind of as his last component. But this is not the right way to do this. And again, I say right way, and it's not like there's no right way with this. It's just there's different ways and there's advisable ways. But most authors seem to indicate that starting from story and characters is the most important place. You can have, for example, a world that doesn't have any particularly interesting components, maybe a world that has a lot of contradictions. But if the story that is being told is captivating, if the characters are intriguing and they cause you to feel empathy and sympathy for them, you'll deal with the crappily built world. But it seems that people are not primed to tolerate a beautiful world in spite of terrible character development, terrible stories. And perhaps that's too false of a dichotomy, but it's the way that I started, and so I have to stay true to that in some capacity. I feel drawn to, at the very least, to stay true to the world that I have built. And from that world, then, I'm sculpting out characters and I'm sculpting out people. I imagine at some point I'll start putting in people that I actually know. I know that that's pretty common for authors to do, and I think I will follow suit at some point. Right now, I'm mostly just trying to wrap my head around dialogue and how to make dialogue interesting, and then I'll work through all these other pieces. Writing is hard, just like drawing is hard. Learning how to make art is hard. Perhaps writing is a little bit easier to get into because we have to do so much of it in school. We're forced to write, and so logically we're going to have some skills that develop. Most of us are never forced to draw or to paint. But this also comes back to why I think people have an easier time learning how to draw than they do paint, because at least in the United States, we spend all of our time with pencils and pens writing and working on things throughout school. So our hands, our hand-eye coordination, our fine motor skills are developed to do that. And brushes feel like this weird, strange thing. It's like somebody getting on a skateboard for the first time or trying to ski the first time. It's so unnatural. And that's because we don't spend a lot of time with a brush. That's at least been my understanding and my thought after working with students for so long. So we do seem to have an advantage toward writing in that capacity because we spend a lot of time writing in the same way that we have this advantage toward drawing. On a completely different note, the map that is taking place is sketched onto, or not sketched really, it's like primed or etched into a wall inside of a dungeon. That's the kind of goal I'm going for here. I know this is one of the early sketches of this little sorceress because she doesn't have her braids right now. I developed that maybe on the 8th or 9th or 10th of the Inktober pieces. It's been really fun. If you guys did not take part in Inktober, it's over now, obviously, but I would highly recommend that you do it next year. The reality is, however, you don't have to wait for something like that to kick you in the pants. If you have a project you want to work on, just start it now. And if you don't have a project to work on, I would encourage you to develop one. Inktober started just as it always has this year for me, as a month-long challenge of 31 ink drawings based on someone else's prompts. But as I worked on it, I developed an idea, and now what I want to do is I want to go back and take all of these sketches, develop new ones, and construct a story with this little character. I'm going to have to redo a bunch of these drawings, and maybe I'll have to redo all of them, but I've worked out a lot of ideas. I've worked out a lot of executions on where I can put her, how to represent her, how to show facial expressions. Things that I haven't done on my own much in the past because, frankly, they're stressful. So now I have an idea, though. I want to see, can I build a children's book from some of these stories, from these goofy things that are embedded in my greater stories, but coming at it from a different angle. This happened because of Inktober. And if it goes on to be something of any manner of substance, even if it's just for me, then I will continue to come back to Inktober and be thankful for it, and recommend that other people do it as well. The big thing, though, is if you have projects push you. Projects push you to do things that you wouldn't do otherwise. I had to research things, I had to practice things, I had to do tons of sketches. And some of those sketches ended up going nowhere, but they gave me explorations of different compositions, of different thumbnail exercises, of different ideas. Many of them changed substantially. I think maybe only once or twice in the entirety of the 31 prompts did I get my sketch right the first time and went, yes, this will work. Most of the time I had to do at least 2, and some of them are like 5, 6, or 7. And that's fine, because you're working out ideas every single time. My students didn't like it when I was in the classroom with them, asking them to do at least 3 sketches before they started their final draft. I didn't always tell them that I had to do 50 before I started when I was in college, but again, I don't need to make a 7th grader do the same things that I had to do when I was 21. Sketches are beneficial because they force you to do things outside of what you would have done. If you just go with your initial sketch, often it's just your initial idea haphazardly put together. When you do a second, you're often working things out from a slightly different angle. When you do a third, you're starting to stretch yourself. But when you do a 4th, 5th, and beyond, you're now actually reaching for new ideas that would never have occurred to you in your original mindset. You don't always go with those things, but when I design thumbnails for videos, nowadays, I often go with whatever the last iteration is. So sometimes I make 1, sometimes I make 5, but if I make 5, I generally go with number 4 or 5. And this happened when I was in school as well. I did hundreds of sketches sometimes for a single project. I never used the first one. Usually it was somewhere in the heart of that, about 30 or 35, before I got bored and just BS my way through the last 15 or 20 because I was tired of doing sketch after sketch after sketch. All of this to say, I suppose, that projects are important, that committing to work on a thing is important, that sketching and preparing for a thing is important. I've talked about this lately in some of my podcasts, but there's something really important about finishing a thing. I can come back to drawings like this, especially coming back to the whole month worth of drawings like this in a year, especially if something terrible happens and I have to take a break from my art. It's beneficial to come back and go, I could do something. At some point I did, and maybe I don't possess those skills anymore, but I can go back and I can relearn how to do it. Look, the proof is there. So I would encourage you to embark on projects, try things that are uncomfortable, try new things. You will eventually, inevitably, I believe, run into new things that bring you joy, new loves, things that you would never have engaged in before. You don't sit down most days and decide to draw a crab, but if the project requires you to have a reference for a crab at some point, you're going to do it. And now that exists in your mind, and maybe you won't draw a crab again for years, but you know what? The plating of a crab is not terribly dissimilar than the plating of some far sci-fi robots, or from plate armor. Things tie into other things. So I would encourage you to develop a project, to work on something, to see it through. There's importance there. And don't feel like you have to justify everything to all the people around you. Working on art for art's sake alone is beautiful. It is fine, in fact. And I think maybe it is one of the most human things you could ever do. To be truly human is to create. It's one of the things that separates us from so many other creatures on this planet. It makes us special. And regardless of where you're coming from, religiously or scientifically, we are creators and we are built to create. It brings us joy. And if you have the need as an artist to make things, that need will always persist. So just give in. Design your projects, make beautiful things, make ugly things, but just make. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.